Tokyo Radio has already sunk this ship 4 times. That's not a mistake in the broadcast. It's propaganda, repeated so often it's become a kind of dark joke among the crew themselves. Japanese radio announcing with total confidence that the American heavy cruiser USS Houston has been destroyed. Again and again, the Houston keeps steaming into the next fight, battered, undermanned, 17 months from home without relief, because there is no one left to relieve her. Now, on the night of the 28th of February, 1942, in the narrow black water of the Sunda Strait between Java and Sumatra, the Houston and one Australian light cruiser, the Perth, are about to run straight into the reason Tokyo Radio will finally, for once, be telling the truth. Ahead of them, 56 Japanese transport ships, 35,000 invasion troops, a screen of cruisers and destroyers built to protect all of it. Oh, 2 Allied cruisers are about to fight that. This is the last stand of the Galloping Ghost of the Java coast. By early 1942, USS Houston had already earned a reputation that outran the facts by a wide margin. Assigned as flagship of the U.S. Asiatic Fleet, she had been in the Far East for 17 straight months without returning home, worn down by continuous sea duty at exactly the moment the Pacific War opened with its heaviest opening blows. In under 3 months of fighting, Japanese propaganda had claimed to sink her 4 separate times. Each time she was still afloat, still fighting, still absorbing whatever the next engagement demanded of a ship and crew that had never been given the chance to properly recover. That reputation had a cost the crew felt daily. There was no dry dock waiting, no fresh replacement crew. The 1,100 sailors and Marines aboard were running the same equipment, standing the same watches, fighting the same unrelenting operational tempo month after month, in a theater where the Japanese advance seemed unstoppable on every front at once. Singapore had fallen on the 15th of February, the Netherlands East Indies, the string of islands Houston and her allies were now trying to defend, was, by every honest assessment available to Allied command, next. Below decks, the ship carried the particular exhaustion of men who had stopped expecting relief. Boiler rooms ran hot around the clock. Ammunition hoists that should have been overhauled months earlier were kept running through improvisation and stubbornness. Sailors slept in shifts wherever they could find space because general quarters could sound at any hour and frequently did. The mess had long since run short of anything resembling variety, and men who had once complained about the food had stopped complaining because complaining assumed a future in which better food might eventually arrive. Alongside her sailed the Australian light cruiser HMAS Perth under Captain Heck Waller and a small, exhausted collection of American, British, Dutch, and Australian warships operating under a hastily assembled joint command known as ABDA. It was an alliance built from desperation more than doctrine. 4 navies, different signal procedures, different languages and places, thrown together to try to hold a line that, by the last week of February, was already collapsing. On the 27th of February, the Battle of the Java Sea had already gutted what remained of ABDA's striking power. Ships were sunk, others were damaged and scattered. By the following evening, Houston and Perth, bloodied, low on fuel and ammunition, separated from the rest of the shattered fleet, were making for the port of Tanjung Priok, hoping to refuel, rearm, and find some way to escape south to Australia before the noose closed completely. There was no time for any of that. Orders arrived instead. Proceed immediately to Cilacap on Java's southern coast through the Sunda Strait. the narrow channel separating Java from Sumatra. It was meant to be a route out. Nobody aboard either ship yet knew that the very invasion force aimed at Java was, at that exact moment, moving into the same stretch of water from the opposite direction. Houston was down to a fraction of her normal ammunition supply after Java Sea. Perth wasn't much better off. Neither ship had air cover, neither had any realistic prospect of reinforcement. They were simply two tired cruisers trying to slip through a strait in the dark on the last leg of what both crews hoped would be the beginning of the voyage home. For the men aboard, that hope was almost tangible. Word had spread through both ships that this run was meant to be the start of the journey south, toward Australia, towards something resembling safety. Sailors who had not slept properly in days allowed themselves, for a few hours, the smallest possible margin of optimism. Checking gear, writing letters that would never be sent, talking in low voices about what they'd do first once they made it home. None of them yet knew that the strait ahead of them was not an escape route at all, but the very doorway the Japanese invasion fleet was using to enter Java from the opposite direction. Just before midnight on the 28th, lookouts on Perth spotted unidentified ships in Banton Bay. It took very little time to confirm what they were looking at. The leading edge of the Japanese Western invasion force, a fleet of 56 transport ships loaded with roughly 35,000 troops, protected by cruisers and destroyers of the Imperial Japanese Navy. Captain Waller had a choice that wasn't really a choice at all. Turn away and risk being run down in open water with no room to maneuver, or go straight through the anchorage, guns blazing, and try to fight a path out the other side. He chose to attack. For the better part of an hour, Perth and Houston tore into the invasion fleet at point-blank range, in total darkness, guns firing as fast as crews could load them. They damaged or sank Japanese transports. In the chaos and confusion of a night battle, fought at close quarters in a crowded anchorage, several Japanese vessels were struck, not by Allied gunfire, but by torpedoes fired by their own escorting warships. Friendly fire born entirely out of how tight, how frantic, and how confused those minutes became. Star shells burst overhead, throwing the whole anchorage into flickering, hard-edged light and shadow, long enough to pick out a target, then gone, plunging the water back into darkness, broken only by muzzle flashes. Below decks, ammunition parties worked in a haze of cordite smoke and heat, passing shells hand to hand as fast as the guns could fire them, with no time to think about how quickly the ready supply was running out. On the bridge, officers were making decisions in seconds that would ordinarily take minutes. Which target, which bearing, which gun to shift, because in a fight this close, hesitation cost ships. It could not last. The escorting Japanese cruisers and destroyers, vastly superior in number, closed in from multiple directions. Perth absorbed hit after hit, gunfire, then torpedoes. Waller ordered the crew to abandon ship. 20 minutes later, she rolled over and went down, taking her captain and more than 350 of her sailors with her. Houston fought on alone. With Perth gone, every Japanese gun in range that could bear on the American cruiser she kept firing anyway, badly outnumbered, taking hit after hit, her ammunition running toward empty exactly when she needed it most. Reports from survivors described gun crews continuing to serve their weapons even as the ship absorbed torpedo strikes that were tearing her apart below the waterline. Because there was, by that point, nothing left to do but keep fighting until the ship could no longer answer. The ship's forward turret had already fallen silent, out of ammunition, its crew reduced to standing by, with nothing left to load. Aft, the remaining guns kept firing on whatever bearing offered a target, working through the last of the ready-use shells, while damage control parties fought fires and flooding. They no longer had the men or the equipment to fully contain. The list to starboard grew with every passing minute, steep enough that men were beginning to brace themselves against bulkheads simply to stay upright while they worked. Captain Albert Rooks was killed on his own bridge before the end came. Command passed to his executive officer, who gave the order. Every remaining man aboard had been waiting, dreading, and preparing for abandoned ship. What followed after the order to abandon ship was, for many survivors, worse than the battle itself. Japanese gunners raked the water and the ship's decks with machine gun fire as men tried to get clear, cutting down sailors and marines who had already lost their ship and were simply trying to survive the night. Houston rolled and sank shortly after, taking roughly 700 of her crew of just over 1,000 down with her. In the water, in the dark, surrounded by burning wreckage and oil slicks, survivors from both ships clung to whatever floated: rafts, hatch covers, each other. One account, passed down through survivor testimony, describes the Houston's chaplain giving up his place on an overcrowded raft, not once, but twice, pulled back by his own men each time, before finally slipping quietly away into the water so the younger sailors around him might have a better chance. Of Houston's crew of roughly 1,061, only 368 survived the sinking. Of Perth's crew of roughly 680, 328 made it out of the water alive, and of those, all but 4 were captured by the Japanese within days. 4 men from Perth evaded capture entirely, a detail almost too improbable to be true against the numbers everyone else faced that night. For the men who survived the water, only to be taken prisoner, the war was very far from over. Houston's survivors were scattered into Japanese POW camps across Java, Thailand, and eventually Japan itself, many of them forced into slave labor on the Burma-Thailand Railway, the notorious Death Railway that would claim thousands of Allied prisoners' lives before the war's end. 79 of Houston's survivors died in captivity before liberation came in 1945. Of Perth's captured crew, roughly 1 in 3, 105 men, never made it home, dying of disease, starvation, and brutal treatment on the same railway and in the same camps. The 2 crews, American and Australian, who had fought side by side in the last hours of the Sunda Strait, went on to suffer through years of captivity side by side as well, a shared ordeal that outlasted the battle that created it by more than 3 years. Somewhere beneath the Sunda Strait, the wrecks of Houston and Perth still rest on the seabed, close enough to each other that divers who have visited both describe it as visiting a single battlefield rather than 2 separate sites. For decades, those wrecks were the only monument either ship had. No headline campaign, no widely remembered name, just 2 crews who fought a battle they had almost no chance of winning against a force 40 times their number, because the alternative was simply not fighting at all. They did not stop the invasion of Java. Nothing 2 cruisers could have done that night was ever going to stop 35,000 men from landing. But in the hour they bought, in the ships they damaged and sank in that chaotic, close-range fight in Bantan Bay, and in the example they set for 2 Allied navies fighting a war that, in February 1942, looked very much like it might already be lost. USS Houston and HMAS Perth earned a place in the history of both nations that outlasted the propaganda broadcasts, insisting wrongly that the Galloping Ghost had already gone down. This is the last stand of USS Houston and HMAS Perth. The battle two exhausted crews fought because retreat was no longer an option, and neither, as it turned out, was surrender. Subscribe for more untold stories of the men who did what everyone else said was impossible.